Hello, everyone. I'm Desiree Hanford from the SABEW Training Committee and an assistant professor at the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University. On behalf of SABEW, welcome to today's webinar on how to cover the Great Resignation. We have a great moderator and panel here today. Our moderator today is Jennifer Liu. Jennifer is a work reporter for CNBC Make It, where she covers hiring trends, the workplace, and professional success. Joining us as panelists are Pedro da Costa, senior reporter at Market News International. Pedro is a Federal Reserve and economics correspondent at Markets News International. Previously, he was a communications director and host of the State of Working America podcast at the Economic Policy Institute. Also joining us is Ian Williamson, Dean of the Paul Merage School of Business. He was appointed Dean of the Business School on January 1st of this year. Prior to joining the business school, he served as Pro Vice Chancellor and Dean of Commerce at the Wellington School of Business and Government at Victoria University of Wellington, New Zealand. Dean Williamson is a globally recognized expert in the area of human resource management. To our listeners, if you have a question for the panel, please drop it in the Zoom chat. Those questions will go to Jennifer and she'll be posing them to the panel. Also, feel free to use hashtag SABEW on Twitter. With that, I'll hand things over to Jennifer. Jennifer?
Excellent. Thank you, Desiree. Thanks everyone for being here. Pedro, Dean Williamson, and all the SABEW folks on the line. So, the US is on track to record roughly 46 million job quits in 2021, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. That comes out to about 1 in 4 workers quitting their job this year. Turnover reached a record high in September when 4.4 million people, or about 3% of the workforce, quit their job in that month alone. There have been a lot of angles to this story. Some highlights, restaurant workers walking off the job due to poor conditions, hospitals offering $40,000 hiring bonuses to hire nurses, people burning out and rage quitting, and of course, as has been the case throughout the pandemic, people leaving work due to illness, concerns over the virus, and ongoing caregiving challenges. So to start off, I'd like to kick it over to our panelists for your elevator pitch. What is the Great Resignation and what is happening? Pedro, how about we start with you?
Thanks so much, Jennifer. And thank you, SABEW, for having me today on this panel. This is a really interesting subject, and it's been a fascinating ride to cover, as you suggest. I just wanted to open with some brief comments on recent improvements in the labor market, what they mean for how we cover the economy, and how we should try to make sense of what happens next. So, as I mentioned, it's been a fascinating thing to watch this great resignation phenomenon, as we've come to call it. And it was the unexpected result of a combination of forces. So we had the pandemic, but we also had a very unusual fiscal response to it that was very unlike what happened in the Great Recession. And that kind of buffeted the shock, especially for lower income Americans, in a way that gave them options that they previously lacked. And so kind of that strengthened bargaining power in a way that, as you described, Jennifer, turned it into suddenly turned us from staring down into a Great Depression potentially to really seeing a kind of employees market for once, in a long time. And so that was an amazing thing to watch. At the same time, I think there's some context to be had around that, right? So the record number of quits has been concentrated in hard-hit industries like healthcare, hospitality, retail. So the industries that have been most affected by the pandemic, and industries that have been historically been at the lower end of the pay scale. And given how much churn and uncertainty the job market still faces, given the ongoing virus risk and rising inflation concerns, we don't have a lot of clarity as to where these record quitters are going, what kind of raises they're actually garnering in their new jobs. In fact, inflation is eating away at much, if not all, of the wage increases. So for instance, real average hourly earnings for October rose 0.4%, but the 0.9% rise in inflation that month more than offset that gain. So people are actually losing ground. So in the same way that economists and Fed officials have been humbled by the volatility that COVID has wrought on the economic cycle and on supply chains, I think we as journalists should keep the broadest lens possible when we look at the labor market. So it's not just the low jobless rate and the number of quits that matter. We should be asking questions about why certain groups are still being left out of the recovery, and keep wondering why labor force participation is still some 4 million workers short of its pre-pandemic heights. In fact, if you look not just at participation, but the employment to population ratio, which is really the percentage of the population that's working, you can see it actually peaked at just under 65% around 2000. And it's been declining ever since to around 59% today. Some of that is demographics, but the last recovery showed that a very strong labor market can bring people back. And so I'd caution that in general, also that labor market power tends to be tilted heavily toward employers, and that we shouldn't overstate how much bargaining power workers might have at any particular juncture. So I think finally it's our job as journalists not to take the word of economists or financial talking heads that we've reached that elusive juncture they call full employment without asking actual workers if they feel that their own skills and potential are being fully deployed. So that'd be my 50 cents, and I look forward to the discussion.
Yes, thank you. Dean Williamson, over to you. What is the big idea behind the Great Resignation from where you're sitting?
Thank you, Jennifer, and very much appreciate the opportunity to join this great conversation today. And thank you, Pedro, for your fantastic comments. I may be focused on three things. One, I think it's useful to think about this in a broader context. So we certainly have seen in the last 2 years or so a whole host of external shocks that have impacted the labor market. But if you look over the last 10 years, what you've seen is a consistent rise in voluntary turnover by workers. And so we have been seeing higher levels of switching happening in the workplace, not just in the United States, but globally for a very long period of time. And I think there's probably some structural elements around that. A big cause of that probably is the role of the economy switching more to service-based work as opposed to growth in, say, agriculture or manufacturing. Why that's relevant is that service-based economies, broadly speaking, rely heavily on individuals developing generalizable skills or skills that are easily transportable across roles that are not tied to specific physical machinery or land. And so that allows for switching in a way that's different than we have economies that are based on other types of operations. I think the other thing we have to appreciate is with the generalizability of skill sets, which allows for switching, you also have greater access to information by workers. And so it's gotten easier and easier and easier for workers to find out about opportunities. And maybe one of the things that's been very unique in the last few years has been a move, or at least a legitimation of remote work as a mechanism by which individuals can contribute. So broadly speaking, you just basically see lower switching costs for employees. And that obviously generates different types of behavior than you might have seen. So that's one point, just thinking about the broader context, that this phenomenon we're seeing is part of a broader trend that has been going on for some period of time. I think the other thing that'd be relevant is to think about the role of demographics or the composition of the workforce. And so we're also seeing some other factors play out here. The aging of the workforce in the United States, I think, should be appreciated. And there's this question as to people are leaving, where are they going? And one thought around this is perhaps many of these individuals are retiring because of the age of our population. And that's something that the economy here in the US, but again, this is a global phenomenon. Many economies are dealing with this. And probably the one that is most severe right now, most pressing, is actually in China, where you're seeing a rapid aging. And so big questions around how will we generate these individuals back into the workplace? Are there people actually there? And so that's a big part of it. But I think the other aspect around this is, as has been consistent in the US economy and the US labor workforce for many, many decades, is the role of race and gender in this dynamic. and how this is playing out for differently across different communities. And I think there's big questions around that. But one other aspect around this demographics is not just in terms of composition, but the composition has implications for preferences. And so we have the most diverse workforce we probably have ever seen in the US. And that diversity plays out with, if people have lower switching costs and perceptions of choice, they are more likely to rely upon their preferences in making these choices. And the preferences of the workforce have never been more diverse. And so the expectations of what they have and what they're looking for has huge implications about whether or not individuals will find jobs attractive or desirable. And that puts a lot more pressure on organizations to provide jobs which are desirable to a wider range of individuals than traditionally you probably have thought about. And I guess the last point I make around this as a, just an opening conversation piece would be the response from organizations plays a big role in the behavior of individuals. And so what is the innovation in the way in which employers are thinking about work being conducted? It's had big implications about whether or not they will attract workers. And so you have various levels of rigidity by employers, by individual organizations in terms of how they are responding to the two other factors that I just described. And what is the level of innovation that employers are willing to put in when it comes to everything from the benefits they offer, the way in which they pay, what pay is tied to, where work is done, the hours in which work is done, the traditional pathways that we have around careers and internal succession. I think many of these things, many of the traditional ways in which organizations have done this, by and large, are not as innovative as they should be and do not reflect the choices that many organizations have at their availability or the preferences of their workers. And so, I think is often the case that the less innovative, less creative employers are oftentimes the ones that are punished the most when it comes to shifts in the labor market. And I think what you're seeing now is a little bit of that being highlighted. So those are sort of three broad things that I would think about as we try to dissect what is actually happening. The context of this is actually more than just the last 2 years. There have been some major changes that have been happening. Part of that is the demographics of our workforce have been shifting for a period of time, and that's bringing different types of preferences. And finally, what is the innovation in the organizational responses, and how does it allow some organizations to be more or less competitive when it comes to attracting talent?
Fantastic, thank you. So I want to get to the way that the momentum of the Great Resignation and high quits, and of course the appetite for stories of people quitting really has not slowed down throughout 2021, despite the ways that the pandemic itself has evolved, especially in recent months. Pedro, I guess for you first, what exactly makes this story so compelling?
I think the fact that it's unique, that we've been, as I suggested in my initial remarks, employers tend to have more power, more information, more data, and more choices, right? And so it's usually an employer's market. So for there to be an employee's market for once seems like a sort of David and Goliath story where the little guy is finally getting a shot to walk out the door and have options. And so I think there's a sort of human side to that story that's very compelling. And to your point, it's kept happening because the job market has been improving at a pretty remarkable rate. If you look at the speed from which we went to, from a 14% jobless rate to a 4.2% jobless rate, which is close to what economists consider kind of as low as we tend to get historically. It's been pretty amazing. So the consistency with which the job market has improved, despite, as you suggest, the fact that COVID conditions have gone in waves, but the economy has adapted in ways that sort of the sectors might have shifted, but enough of the gears kept moving that the overall macro picture was extremely positive. Helped, of course, by the fiscal stimulus and all the support that came in the form of, jobless benefits and all the other things. So.
Yeah, I think, similar to Pedro's comments, one, everybody can relate, right? Because everybody has a bad day at their work and they go, you know what, I don't want to do this anymore. And that's just a natural human experience that everyone on the planet can relate to. And so to sort of see this phenomena as one is very tactical and very tangible for anyone's life. So I can clearly see how, and of course that gains momentum because the numbers we're talking about become such that almost everybody knows someone that has recently switched jobs. And so then it becomes even more of a day-to-day story for our personal lives. I think the other aspect around this has been, it is happening in an environment where there was so much uncertainty about so many aspects of what we typically have seen as very stable. And how have people responded to the trauma associated with these various different issues? Because I think we have to have, there's a context here around, yes, this has been a trend that's been happening, but what we are seeing more recently is happening during a period of great trauma for everyone. And so there's a story here around how do people respond to trauma and how do they respond to uncertainty? And, you know, it's not clear to me that this trauma is causing people to ask this broader existential question about, you know, what is the purpose of what I'm doing? And that's the driver of this. But I certainly think that's an element around this which provides a very interesting view into the lens of the way in which the psychology of how individuals are dealing with, you know, huge levels of uncertainty. And maybe I think a third thing around this is a story which it doesn't add up, you know, and to some extent. And so there's a sense that there's another chapter which is coming, which also adds to uncertainty because you have numbers which we have not seen in the labor market pretty much ever, that they kind of all coalesce. And there's a lot of questions about the broader macroeconomic conditions, which we haven't kind of seen ever. And there's this story about what's going to happen next. Is this the equilibrium? Is it stable? How will this respond? Are the decisions right? Are they wrong? And so there's a sort of tune in next week aspect to the story, which is quite compelling for individuals.
A great point. If I could pick up on that, just that your point about trauma is really important because as Jennifer suggested in her intro, this is not just a happy story, right? A lot of people are quitting because of, you know, everything from the inability to work because of health, their own health conditions or family members' health conditions or caregiving duties because of, you know, structural issues related to the pandemic. So it really is not just a sort of everybody gets to stick it to the boss kind of story. It's much more nuanced than that.
Yeah. Yeah, and Dean Williamson, back to you. I wanted to, you know, give a little bit more room as far as providing the context of, you mentioned that the Great Resignation is not a story that started in 2021. I remember back in 2019, going into 2020, we were seeing some of the highest shares of people quitting in history up until now. So, you know, can you kind of discuss the ways in which, you know, this is a story that really started before this year?
Yeah, it's again, we've been seeing consistently for, you know, pretty much 10 years, high levels of mobility globally. So that, you know, the US is a perfect example of this, but you can look to several other economies around the world where you've just seen the average tenure of individuals in jobs has declined. And, you know, I can think of many conversations I've had with leaders and organizations that it always goes something like this: they bemoan or they criticize the younger generation for not having loyalty. And that's been going on for a very long period of time. And there is a logic here. And again, I should point, and I think Pedro pointed this out, like we need to be careful in thinking about there's different labor markets involved here. So there's, you know, different types of skills, different types of roles. But there is a logic around when you are a service knowledge-based economy, what workers I think are beginning to see is understanding, seeing more makes me more valuable, right? And that means that many of the benefits of a very long-term relationship in an organization, which meant you became the expert at that organization's processes and routines, many of those are not as valuable in the workplace as seeing multiple processes, multiple routines, multiple procedures in organizations. So if I've worked in 3 organizations and understand their processes and procedures as a knowledge worker, in many respects, that makes me 3 times more valuable than if I've only seen one. And what I've noticed, particularly in our educational settings, is our students, you know, if they think about the way they work, they're planning their careers, have really started to incorporate that into the way they think about their work. and how they're sort of saying, can I get access to that platform, this platform, that platform? It's going to give me more flexibility and more options. And so that movement to a knowledge-driven economy, a service-driven economy, has some really big implications about the way individuals think about optimizing their career paths, which oftentimes don't align with the traditional internal labor market systems that really haven't existed for a very long time if you actually look at how organizations work. But that model or that normative doesn't make actually as much tactical sense.
So, the narrative of the Great Resignation has largely been that it is this worker-led kind of like employees have the upper hand movement. Pedro, I'm wondering if you can speak more to, as you're reporting, diving into the data, where are you finding, backup to focus in on who exactly is leading the Great Resignation? How, if so, are they benefiting from this moment?
Yeah, it's not an easy thing to sort of, cross-examine the data, because you get one slice. But pretty much with quits, you can only get a sort of sectoral sense, and then later you can see where the hires are happening, but you don't get a sense of matching worker for worker. My sense is that the wage gain, the wage data certainly is a good place to look, right? Because if workers have significant bargaining power, then they should be garnering significant increases in wages. And I would say that the gains are so far concentrated at the bottom, and that makes sense given that these are kind of service-driven quits and churn. And so that's where it's happening the most. But I would emphasize that I don't think it's a. So you made the point earlier that he reached a previous record number of quits and at the tail end of the Great Recession recovery, right? And the reason we did that is not just because of kind of forces outside of people's control. There were policy actions at work. The Fed had been keeping rates very low for very long, almost 10 years. And that had finally started to yield fruit without any inflation coming about. And now the Fed finds itself in a totally different predicament because it thought it could do the same thing this time. And it failed to see that we had a supply chain crunch that was going to affect not just the prices that everybody is facing, but also the labor force itself, because the labor shortage can be traced in part to supply chain issues. So it's really a fascinating juncture and one without very few clear answers.
Yeah, I think, if we look over the next 12 months, there's a sense in most of the business leaders that I speak to that we're certainly not at an equilibrium in any way, shape, or form. And that there are several major issues that decisions will be made or action will happen, or there will be occurrences which will create could create very different types of reactions, both by employers and by employees. And of course, these are categories around, one of the comments that one of the executives that I was speaking with, COVID's not done with us in any way, shape, or form. And that has huge implications, and that'll have implications about confidence in various different ways: consumption, confidence about personal health and well-being, confidence about future investment. So that'll be a big one. The story around inflation and interest rates is a huge one. And that has big implications around how we will see investment dollars flow or funnel, what that means about wages. And so that's a big story. And then there's another story here, which is around, and it does relate to supply chain, but actually it's more broader geopolitical stability issues, which COVID has some implications on, but there are other non-COVID related factors that are driving that. And that has huge implications about trade and demand and supply. So we're at this, any one of those would be the number one economic story in a typical period of time. All three of them are going to be the number one A, B, and C story for the next 12 months. And that level of complexity really is something we'd have to go back quite a bit of time to think about.
Yeah, Dean Williamson, you said it well when you said that there's a next chapter. It feels like there's another shoe to drop. So it's not like, it's not like a mission accomplished kind of story.
Yeah, and I mean, on I guess the management side of things, the business side of things, high turnover is obviously a major disruption for employers. So maybe Dean Williamson, we can start with you. You know, how are businesses possibly approaching this moment as a moment of opportunity?
Well, I mean, the knee-jerk reaction for many, or I think it kind of goes through a period of frustration, then resignation, and you know, in terms of why is this happening? Okay, I guess, you know, I just got to raise my wages, right? This is the typical response, and so certainly you're seeing some evidence around that, and as Pedro mentioned, particularly in the lower paying roles, you're seeing those salaries going up, and there's probably arguments to be made that they were probably too low to begin with in terms of being able to have a sustainable, attractive workforce. But what we're also picking up on is that the money, from an organizational perspective, maybe the easiest thing from organizations to do in direct competition is to raise wages. That actually is not the most effective way of creating stickiness with your workforce. It kind of becomes the necessary but not sufficient in developing a workforce that's engaged and highly productive. So what are the other innovations that organizational leaders are willing to do? How are they willing to make investments in their internal operations in terms of increasing their complexity to address higher levels of preferences or higher variation in preferences by their workers? And so, you know, one of the big conversations that most organizations are dealing with is how are they going to deal with remote work? And that will be a very interesting innovation. I can look at our own organization where that's been the University of California, and particularly University of California, Irvine, very big conversation around how are we going to use that as a mechanism to make our workplace attractive to retain talent. And that's particularly relevant in our space because, you know, we are competing for largely highly skilled individuals, but we're not paying at the rate that you might see in, say, commercial settings. And so what are the other attributes that people are willing to put into their workplace? And, you know, and it's at all phases. You know, I was reading a really interesting article about a pizza chain, which was paying its workforces in Bitcoin, because it was allowing them to have a response to a particular preference, but also faster payment than what would typically happen with the traditional payment cycles. And, you know, that's a preference now that individuals might have. I mean, the notion of an employee making demands upon or an employer responding to preferences about the actual currency of payment in the US context is probably not something we would have envisioned 3 or 4 years ago, but it's actually possible. And so, you know, what are remote work or the way in which we do work? So these are all options that now leaders are having to put on the table to think about how do we bring together a repackage of rewards, a total rewards perspective to compete at a very, you know, tactical level with other organizations in our sector to make sure that we have a workplace that is attractive and engaging and motivational to a group of workers. So that's where I think at the tactical level, organizational leaders should be focusing. I think there's some really interesting stories about why and how. I mean, there was a recent article about, you know, we're moving to a 4-day work week in some organizations. And these are all tactical responses that are driven by how do I create this place that people get excited about when I can't just increase dollar for dollar, which is the easiest thing to copy in most cases.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Pedro, from your reporting, from your discussions of this, are you seeing any, you know, patterns or maybe like surprising ways that organizations are responding?
I agree with Dean Williamson that it's sort of like they have to have their arms twisted into doing it. If you think about remote work, it was so frowned upon before the pandemic. It was thought of as, you know, if you're going to be the remote worker, you're not going to be in the loop, you're not going to get promoted. There's all this sort of taboo around it. And suddenly we were forced into this experiment and it worked. And so a lot of employers were, you know, pulled into it kicking and screaming, but after a few months, they were like, oh, this isn't too bad. And we're saving money in different ways. And, you know, business travel costs have sure shifted. So I have a hard time. I think the longer this goes on, I have a hard time believing that firms will not find ways to incorporate it. Now, there's some sort of really hard-nosed places, you know, but even the hard-nosed shops like the buttoned-up banks like JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs, they force everybody into the office, and now they have Omicron, they force everybody back home. So that you don't really have a choice at some point, and the virus kind of dictates what you do. So I think some of those innovations are definitely here to stay. And I wonder, as a big picture kind of economic question for us all to report on, I do wonder how much we can expect in terms of productivity gains, right? Like this might be a major productivity boom for the economy in the long run in ways that we hadn't thought about. So that might be kind of a positive run twist to this story.
Yeah, building on that point, what you're going to see at the organizational level is, the question I would have is the managerial skill, right? And so what this is doing is causing leaders and organization managers and organizations to really go back and reevaluate their own personal skill and capability at reframing the work environment. Like what actually is the value creation process that my employees are engaging in? Do I actually know that? Or have I been kind of working off of a template that was handed to me? Do I understand all the various options available? Have I taken the time to learn about those things? And then certainly, have I developed the capability to deal with more complexity in the way in which I create more catered or tailored offerings and packages for my workforce? So skill sets around, being able to communicate more effectively, being able to communicate virtually in the effective manner as well as in person. These are two different things. Being able to understand the concepts of empathy, right? So understanding why individuals would want accommodations, skill sets associated with fairness and equity and how you create and shape that. And these are very different types of skills that will drive success in execution as we move in this space. So there's going to be organizations that will kind of be aware of these things and they'll do them, but they'll do them really poorly because the leadership skill to actually drive execution has not been invested in, or we haven't changed the backgrounds of the leaders so that they have this skill as part of the criteria for selection.
I want to ask about, as we mentioned, this is a story that can be told from a lot of different data points. I think one aspect that I've been seeing is, measuring turnover itself after it's happened is one thing. Measuring sentiment around people thinking of quitting, which, business owners, employers are very attuned to. I've seen surveys that indicate, as low as 26% of the workforce is considering leaving, as high as 95% of people are thinking of quitting. Definitely ring some alarm bells on that. Maybe Pedro, can you speak to, as you're looking at some of these statistics and this kind of data, how you evaluate those numbers and, evaluate their credibility and newsworthiness?
Absolutely. That's been one of the biggest things that came out of the pandemic for kind of econ reporters was that, and for economists themselves, of course, is that they had to rely more on real-time data, especially at the beginning where everything was kind of darkness and fog. They had to rely on these real-time indicators, like open table data became a major, economic index, and, index of restaurant attendance and movie ticket sales, right? Kind of got all these reopening indicators emerged. And so you do get a lot of kind of random surveys in your inbox and you're like, about this one. And it's not always easy, to be honest. And, you have to do your due diligence, figure out who's doing the data and how well credentialed the research is behind it. But I think, one of the indicators that's become that emerged back in my early days as an econ reporter, that was kind of a side indicator that nobody paid attention to, was ADP. And ADP said, look, we have the payroll data. We can kind of replicate, payrolls, and we can do it for you guys ahead of time. In fact, I remember they came to Reuters and they pitched us the indicator. They were going to launch this. They really wanted us to cover. They had to pitch it to every news outlet. And now, as you know, ADP is like, it's not always correct, but the market still moves on it because it's become this massive indicator. So I don't quite know which ones are going to last, but I think there's going to be a new cottage industry of kind of real-time sentiment data for just the reason you've described.
Yeah, Dean Williamson, anything to add there in terms of, what major, voices or indicators that really inform the discussions that you're having about the Great Resignation?
Well, I think the aspect around data or surveys, and I would agree, we're kind of getting inundated with a bunch of different attempts to make sense of what we're seeing. So we don't really have a uniform understanding of that, because it's kind of emerging every day. But sticking with some of the areas that I've highlighted, this issue around employers' sense of engagement, satisfaction, and then also updating employee data around what attributes of work they're finding or putting preferences on or finding useful. And then mapping that on to how is that translating over into their behavior. So, we know that we're very calculating in the way in which we evaluate any job opportunity as people. We don't just maximize on one particular attribute. We don't just maximize on pay. We maximize on a whole host of things. And I think the big question that I'm interested in right now is, I actually think the way in which we manage that portfolio psychologically, I wonder whether or not this period of time has made some more permanent shifts in the way in which individual employees allocate, or how their preferences are shaping what that basket looks like. And we've had this conversation a lot with the distinctions between older and younger employees, and do they value different things, and I think you can maybe make a case that if in fact we frame this as a period of major trauma, then the research on trauma would suggest that it's almost always the case that individuals post-trauma have changes in preferences that allocate energy and effort differently towards their behavior. And so what is the post, or I don't even know if we should say post, what is the impact of this on the allocations of preferences that individuals have? And then how does that shift? So questions to individuals about their preferences should be taken very seriously, because I would think they'd be good leading indicators of their behavior and how they'll play out in the workplace.
And that, to me, if I might just add one thing there, is like, that to me is one of the most fascinating types of stories that we've seen in this Great Resignation, of people who were office rats and really thought that they needed to be in the office, and then like had dinner with their family every night and said, no, I can never go back. And I've heard so many sort of not, personal friends or acquaintances that have that kind of behavioral shift. So I wonder, I think there's a lot of that going on.
Yeah, and historically, when we've had these conversations, we've positioned those conversations as, I'm making a choice to do these non-work things with a belief and assumption that it is detrimental to my work aspirations.
Exactly.
So we glorify individuals who've made those choices in the past as somehow they've stepped off this mythical ladder, and they're no longer able to attain economic outcomes of choice. And so I think maybe the bigger question around this is, I'm not certain that's the way we should be framing these as being pit against each other. Like, there's a question as to whether or not the economic outcome, the way we can think about that, has shifted. But you mentioned earlier productivity. These are changes which fundamentally shift the way in which we can be productive. And so I just think that that's a foundational question that has big implications for what is the state of the workforce and how we think about productivity going forward.
Excellent. Well, that segues well into my next question for the both of you, whoever would like to go first. But taking the long view, I don't know that anyone would want to venture a guess of what the Great Resignation will look like in 2022, let's say. But taking the long view, looking ahead, let's say 10 to 20 years from now, how will we be talking about the lasting impact of this moment of the Great Resignation?
10, 20, Williamson, please. For you.
I appreciate you deferring to me.
I like the 20. I'll go with 2022. I mean,
yeah, well, one, I think this is, I don't see us moving away from being a more service-driven economy, right? So if that is the case, then many of the attributes that come with that will continue. And so issues around generalizability of skills, portability of skill sets, breaking down of barriers, geographical barriers, and other types of barriers which have tended to restrict mobility of workers. I think we will see a continual trend around that nationally and globally. And the technology that we have will only make that more feasible going forward. So it'll be easier to search, easier to switch, easier to work from different locations. All those things I see would be continuing forward. And so the question you have then at a macro level is, what is the actual size of your workforce? Like right now, we tend to measure that based on geographical basis largely, and that begins to create some challenges. And then I think the other aspect around that becomes, what is the way in which we at a contractual level think about a workforce? So, you know, fluidity will create very different expectations about how we count a person as an employee, because you will have employees being able to have very different types of working relationships with organizations. And that will create some challenges around this as well. So I anticipate you might see a lot more variety around not just, you know, full-time work, multiple part-time work, multiple part-time work with multiple organizations in different different locations. And those types of unique arrangements will become less unique, I think, because again, it goes back to the skill set that actually creates value in the organization. Maybe one other point I would say, and this again is something that is not new, but I think will continue, is you've always historically had this tension around the liability of smallness and the liability of size. So, you know, large organizations and their advantages and small organizations and their advantages. And as we've seen, and maybe related to that is the tyranny of distance and its implications and clustering effects. I would see that, you know, the ability for remote work and some of these scalability components that we have with our technology really question some of the advantages of being very large and promote some of the benefits of being small, the nimbleness. And then it also raises questions around the role of geographical or physical clustering as a driver of productivity, and whether or not that is as important, or the role that that plays in the way we think about workplaces. Because a lot of the way we think about the labor market is congregating of individuals to create some type of productivity benefit. Not certain what that would look like going forward. Maybe that will be less of an impact.
That's really interesting. I'm learning a ton from you as we participate in this panel. I would add that as a, you know, geeky Fed macro watcher, that the path of the next 10, 20 years depends on like the kind of policy response to the moment that we're seeing now, right? Because as I suggested, the moment we're seeing is the result in part of the policy response to the pandemic. But now we have this risk that we might have overshot and that inflation might be taking off. And we have question marks around the kind of future fiscal outlook with the Build Back Better agenda potentially on the rocks. So how well the Fed and Congress manage sort of a soft upward landing of the economy and an easing off of this very high pace of growth into a more sustainable pace might dictate whether this great resignation moment is merely a snapshot or actually represents a turning point in kind of the labor share of not just power, but actual income. That's actually an important measure of, you know, for macro watchers in terms of inequality and income distribution, the labor share of income. So we will see how, you know, how those different forces come together.
You know, one thing I'll share, you know, I remember very vividly, if you look at 2005, 2006, there was pressure on employers to increase wages, hot labor market. There was a lot of mobility that was happening. And I remember speaking to several organizational leaders, and they were saying, you know, this current workforce has never really seen the downsides of a recession. And when we have that, they will appreciate and learn the value of loyalty. And I remember very vividly having a conversation with several leaders in the financial sector, and I was saying that is definitely not what's going to happen. Because what's going to happen is your organizations, in the height of whatever this recession you think is going to happen, you're going to lay off people, and the workers will see this, and their response will be, definitely do not count on you, right? Do not count on you for my viability. And so one strain of thought that people have been emerging is, yes, but if we have a major correction over the next 12 to 24 months, this great resignation story will go away and workers will be appreciative of what they have and they will hold. And I'm like, that is definitely not going to be the lasting outcome of that happening based on the history that we've seen. And so I think this notion of workers having independence, or at least being independent in the way they think about their employment and their careers, separate from the need or interest of the company, that separation, I don't think that's going to get closer based on what we're seeing right now. It will probably only further cement this notion of individuals thinking about their careers and what they want to do and their livelihood, and companies not necessarily being the thing they're going to hitch their wagon to in terms of a long-term outcome. So nothing about this suggests to me a trend towards a reverse back to loyalty. That's not, I don't see that as an outcome. I don't feel I'm taking a lot of risk by making that prediction.
Well, Dean Williamson, I think you touched on this earlier, but we do have a question from the audience. So I'm going to ask it a little more directly reframed, but for both of you, is it harder for large businesses to change and adjust to this new normal in employment, or smaller businesses? And can you explain?
Well, I mean, just going back to what I was saying before, we talk about this liability of size as both, liability of being big and liability of being small. And of course, the story is that the large organizations have the resources, but tend to be very rigid in their responses. Well, the small organizations tend to be very nimble, but tend to lack the resources. I think if there are some shifts in that, the technology has allowed for smaller organizations, if they can get access to the technology, to mask some of their liabilities of smallness, because the technology can be a multiplier effect. So in general, it's the smaller organizations, when it comes to their workforce, they are created, particularly if they're new. And so there's a difference there, small and new versus small and old, but the newer ones, they were created with the workforce of today in mind. And so they tend to have a little bit of an advantage in the sense that they can be more responsive to that. And they bring in individuals with skill sets that map on to that. So I think there's probably a slight advantage around the smaller firms in this particular space, because they can be more responsive to it. But at the end of the day, if I think about this more broadly, the benefits, if there are benefits or productivity benefits, or benefits to the employees that happen, the large firms have to quickly adapt. Right. And so if we're going to get a scale effect of some improvement in our overall labor market, the large firms have to come to the table.
So maybe I'll speak a little bit from personal experience, but and boost my employer a little bit now. So Market News is a fairly small firm, and it's been an incredibly nimble experience to, the transition, and my contacts at like previous employers that are much larger tend to have sort of clunkier experiences. So that's just anecdotally what I've heard, within journalism. But that I could see why that's happening, and I see that also from the institutions that I cover, the Fed. Like they're having a lot more issues with like who's in the office and who's not, and who needs to be there if the president is there, and it's just a lot more layers of potential stress and points of tension, I guess I should call them.
Yeah, I mean, you can look back in history. So one of the examples to look at is the role of the up and out career pathway in law firms. Traditional, you come in, you see your time, you get up, and then eventually you make partner. And if you don't make partner, you leave, right? And that model has been one that was very traditional. And some of the fallout effects around that is it was very had very negative implications for women in those settings, because taking time off for child rearing or those partner structures weren't designed for that. It actually caused the firms in many cases to pay a lot for very inexperienced individuals and sort of hope that they would stick. It had major issues. And if you look at the firms that began to shift away from that, It was the medium-sized, smaller firms that began to dabble with that more because they viewed it as an advantage to get access to talent that they wouldn't normally be able to get access to. It was the very high-profile large firms that had the status and the standing to make a radical change without being sort of damaged in the marketplace from a reputational perspective, that began to sort of shift that on. And then that began to cascade to other firms sort of saying, well, we can try this as well. And so I think you'll see, sort of from a lens around reputation and institutional standing, perhaps similar patterns with the newer, smaller firms will be much more nimble around this. It will take a large, more high-profile set of firms to say, we're willing to put our reputation at risk behind this, and it legitimates it to the broader workforce. And then you get the rest of the players begin to adopt based on their skill set.
We have another audience submitted question here. There's a spate of resignations from must-read senior reporters and columnists. Many seem like they did not have a choice. Pedro, this might be for you. What is the future of journalists over 40? Why isn't there more coverage of forced retirement versus resignation?
As a journalist over 40, I can take that. What the future holds, if somebody knows, please show it to me. I would say that, I would say that like force, it happens in our industry a lot, and I think it's an industry where seniority is increasingly undervalued, and the kind of depth of knowledge is increasingly undervalued because companies have a lot of troubles in terms of generating kind of profit-making business models, and making money from news is intrinsically difficult. But I think that from a macro picture, it doesn't necessarily warrant coverage per se, because I don't think it's enough that these quits are real. Like these numbers are not masking some sort of like all these forced resignations or overstating the number of quits. Like this trend is actually happening. So I think that's why the coverage isn't happening, because it's a real trend. So while I have all too much sympathy for the fate of journalists who might get pushed out of organizations unwillingly, I don't think they kind of factor into the big numbers.
I mean, I think the shift and the various challenges to the business model within media more broadly, that's been an ongoing story for quite a period of time, and it's flowing over quite clearly. I'm not a journalist, so I don't want to act like I have expertise in this, but I mean, I would just make a broader observation. In the history of humankind, we've always valued storytelling, right? That is, and we've used every form of medium that we can to do it, and we revere storytellers. What I think I would say, as a person who sort of studies how organizations respond to disruption, what we're seeing now is uncertainty as to what is the model by which we're able to most effectively deliver stories. And so, that will naturally create a lot of tension and uncertainty in employment for people who are, say, journalists. But the demand for the capability is probably not going away. It's just the way in which we got to come up with another organizational form to deliver it. And maybe it's, not necessarily organizational in the way we think about it. And that's another interesting byproduct of the technology, that you don't need this huge infrastructure to share stories. And so that's a fascinating space, and that I've been watching very closely, actually. It actually has some implications for education as well. We may see the democratization and decentralization of education as an institution because of this.
Absolutely. I mean, some of the academic seminars that I attend as a journalist aren't so different from the ones that I host as a journalist. So, we're not in the same business, but there's some overlap.
There definitely are.
Yeah, on a related note, I'm wondering if you can both speak to any, storylines or angles or trends within the Great Resignation that, you would like to see greater coverage of, or that you believe will kind of bubble up to the surface, maybe, as we head into the next year.
Well, I'm really keen for us, and I think it's really important for the media more broadly to appreciate that these experiences are driven by the values of individuals, and the values are basically going back to the communities they're coming from. And so, it is the case that the way this is playing out in the various different ethnic communities that we have across this country is not the same. And I think it's really useful for the media to sort of be able to portray and tell those different lenses about where are the vulnerabilities that people are experiencing, how are they shaping and perceiving those vulnerabilities, how are the backgrounds of the founders and leaders of the organizations shaping the way they're considering options. And this is so we haven't even talked about the fact that throughout all of this period of time, we also had some of the most, we had the Black Lives Matter movement, we had Me2, we had some of the biggest social issues our country has had to deal with in a very long period of time. And that was also playing out here. And so I think we now have, this point in time where work as a reflection of values and culture is what's playing out. And what is the lens by which culture is shaping the responses to this? And not necessarily in the sense of, is it making us more or less dissimilar, as much as it's just, this is the reality of our cultural values shape how we respond. And, in the context of how that's become much more heightened in our society, I think it'd be really neat to see that story being played out, because it gives us better insight, both from an organizational perspective, but also from a policy perspective.
And I guess I would like to see coverage that, one, doesn't forget to ask workers what's happening to them, because it's really easy to call experts on the labor market and quote them. And it's a lot harder to find actual workers. And, we need to go that extra mile oftentimes to create that voice. I would really focus on labor force participation, because there's been a shift in kind of what we think we can get to, but I think that the last recession shows that we can get a lot more people back in. And as I said, there's still 4 million missing people that might still be not working for different pandemic related reasons, but we don't quite have a great explanation for them. Chair Powell from the Fed called it a puzzle. And I think we should continue to investigate sort of what's happening to these missing workers. And then I think it's important to always look under the hood of the employment data, at different groups, including different racial groups and women, especially. So women's labor force participation has been a major issue, right? There's been a massive exodus. There was a massive exodus of men and women, and the men came back and the women didn't. So that reverses a long-term trend that's really important. And of course, the Black unemployment rate has historically and ridiculously always been double that of the official jobless rate. And there's no good reason for that other than discrimination. And we need to keep asking questions as to why those huge imbalances persist. Some economists often try to explain them away with kind of educational variables, but there's been enough work done to disprove that trope that I think we need to keep asking why minority unemployment rates are still so high.
Fantastic. Well, Dean Williamson, Pedro, I think that wraps the questions that I had prepared and from our audience. So appreciate everyone for participating, and I'll pass it off to Desiree.
A big thank you to you, Jennifer, Pedro, and Dean Williamson. This has been great, incredibly useful. This presentation has been such an interesting topic and so timely. So thank you so much. Please watch your email, everyone, for more information about SABEW's next monthly training session. And finally, if you have a suggestion about a future training topic, please email SABEW at SABEW. Please email sabew@sabew.org. This concludes today's session. And thanks again, everyone. Thanks to our audience. Thanks to our panelists. Thanks to our moderator.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.